We find ourselves in a strange moment of human history. Never before have we possessed such effortless access to nearly everything we could want. Entertainment streams endlessly. Knowledge sits waiting in our pockets. Human connection, or at least its digital simulation, arrives with a single tap. The world has contracted into a glowing rectangle that promises to fill every empty moment with something, anything, to keep our minds occupied. Yet something peculiar is happening beneath this surface of abundance. Across continents and cultures, millions of people report feeling the same unsettling sensation. They describe it as numbness, as paralysis, as a strange inability to care about things that once mattered. They wake up knowing what needs to be done, but cannot summon the energy to begin. They scroll through feeds without reading, watch without seeing, consume without satisfaction. The word we use for this state is demotivation, but that label barely scratches the surface of what is actually occurring. The easy explanation blames the individual. We call it laziness when someone cannot maintain focus. We speak of discipline problems when sustained effort feels impossible. We suggest that people simply need to try harder, want it more, push through the resistance. This interpretation treats motivation as a moral quality, something you either possess or lack based on character strength. If you cannot make yourself move, the thinking goes, then something is fundamentally wrong with you. But what if this entire framework misses the actual problem? What if the issue is not that people have become weaker or less capable, but that the environment itself has become toxic to genuine motivation? Consider the possibility that human beings are not failing to adapt to modern life. Consider instead that modern life has created conditions actively hostile to the psychological mechanisms that generate authentic drive and purpose. Our nervous systems evolved over millennia to function within certain parameters. There were natural rhythms of activity and rest, engagement and withdrawal, stimulation and recovery. The brain developed exquisite sensitivity to novelty and reward because these signals indicated important opportunities or threats in the environment. A flash of movement might mean danger or food. A new sound could signal an approaching storm or the presence of others. These attention mechanisms kept our ancestors alive. The modern world has weaponized these ancient systems. Every notification is engineered to trigger that novelty response. Every endless scroll exploits the brain's hunger for new information. Every autoplay feature hijacks the natural cycle of engagement and rest. What once helped us survive now keeps us trapped in loops of artificial stimulation that provide sensation without nourishment, activity without purpose, engagement without meaning. The neuroscience reveals something troubling. Dopamine, the neurochemical associated with motivation and anticipation, responds powerfully to these digital triggers. But the responses are shallow, brief, unsatisfying. The brain registers each ping as potentially important, releases a small burst of dopamine, and returns to baseline when the stimulus proves meaningless. Over time, this constant firing without genuine reward begins to dull the entire system. The brain becomes less responsive to real sources of meaning and more dependent on the easy hits provided by screens and feeds. This is not about technology being inherently evil. The problem runs deeper than any single device or platform. We have constructed an entire civilization that treats empty time as a problem to be solved. Every pause is considered wasted potential. Every moment of silence represents lost productivity or missed entertainment. We have forgotten, or perhaps never learned, that the human mind needs emptiness the way the body needs sleep. What happens to consciousness under these conditions? The mind that never rests begins to fragment. Instead of thinking, it merely reacts. Instead of contemplating, it consumes. The capacity for sustained attention erodes. The ability to sit with discomfort atrophies. Most critically, the inner space required for reflection, that quiet territory where we process experience and construct meaning, gradually disappears beneath the noise. This is where the crisis of motivation actually originates. not in personal weakness, but in the systematic destruction of the psychological conditions necessary for genuine purpose to emerge. Real motivation does not come from external stimulation. It arises from internal connection, from knowing what matters and why. It requires the ability to sense your own values, to feel your authentic desires, to distinguish between what you actually want and what you have been told to want. But how can anyone maintain that connection when there is never silence? How can you hear your own voice when it is constantly drowned out by 1,000 others? The perpetual barrage of content, opinions, demands, and distractions does not just occupy attention. It colonizes the inner space where selfhood takes shape. We become strangers to ourselves, acting out scripts written by algorithms and social pressures, wondering why none of it feels real or meaningful. The exhaustion people describe is not imaginary. It is the fatigue that comes from running on empty fuel. You can force yourself to keep moving, to keep producing, to keep consuming, but without genuine purpose beneath the activity, every action feels hollow. The soul knows the difference between meaningful effort and empty motion. It can sense when you are chasing goals that do not belong to you, when you are living someone else's idea of a good life. This is why simply demanding more discipline or willpower fails so completely. You cannot solve the problem of meaning with techniques of management. You cannot fill an existential void with productivity hacks. The solution is not to push harder within a broken system, but to recognize that the system itself needs questioning. Perhaps the crisis of motivation is not revealing our personal inadequacy. Perhaps it is revealing that we have built a world fundamentally at odds with human flourishing, a world that values stimulation over substance, distraction over depth, constant activity over purposeful presence. The human brain possesses a remarkable quality that becomes dangerous in the wrong context. It adapts. When exposed repeatedly to certain patterns of stimulus and reward, neural pathways strengthen and reorganize themselves around those patterns. This neuroplasticity allows us to learn languages, master instruments, develop skills. It also means that whatever we practice, we become better at, whether that thing serves us or not. When you check your phone dozens of times per day, you are not just passing time. You are training your brain to seek quick hits of novelty. When you scroll through endless content without meaningful engagement, you are practicing a particular form of attention, one that skims surfaces without diving deep. When you fill every pause with external input, you are teaching your nervous system that silence is something to be avoided, that being alone with your thoughts represents a threat rather than an opportunity. These are not neutral habits. They reshape the architecture of consciousness itself. The brain that once could sustain focus for hours gradually loses that capacity. The mind that could tolerate uncertainty and discomfort becomes increasingly reactive and avoidant. What we are witnessing is not simply distraction, but a fundamental alteration in how awareness operates, a shift from depth to surface, from contemplation to consumption, from being to merely processing. The consequences reveal themselves slowly, which makes them easy to miss until they become severe. You might notice that reading a book feels harder than it used to, that your mind wanders after a few paragraphs. You might find yourself unable to sit through a conversation without the urge to check your device. You might realize that you cannot remember what you did yesterday. That days blur together into an undifferentiated stream of small distractions and minor anxieties. These are symptoms of a mind that has lost its center. Without regular practice of sustained attention, the capacity for it weakens. Without time spent in reflection, the ability to process experience and integrate it into understanding diminishes. The overloaded consciousness does not become more capable through constant stimulation. It becomes more fragile, more scattered, less able to distinguish what matters from what does not. There exists a crucial difference between thinking and merely having thoughts. Thinking requires active engagement, the deliberate turning over of ideas, the patient examination of assumptions and implications. It demands time and space and mental energy. Having thoughts, by contrast, is passive. It is the constant stream of mental chatter, the endless flow of reactions and associations and half-formed notions that parade through awareness without ever being truly examined. The hyperstimulated mind excels at having thoughts, but becomes progressively worse at actual thinking. It reacts to each new input with a burst of associations, then moves on before any deeper processing occurs. It is always in motion, but never truly engaged, always busy, but never genuinely productive. This creates a peculiar form of exhaustion, one where you feel mentally drained despite having accomplished nothing of substance. Reflection, true reflection, requires something the modern world actively discourages. It requires stillness, not the frozen tension of forced meditation, but the natural quiet that emerges when external demands release their grip. It is in this spaciousness that experiences can settle, that emotions can be felt rather than merely reacted to, that values can emerge from beneath the layers of conditioning and expectation. Without this reflective capacity, we lose touch with the foundations of identity itself. Who are you when you strip away all the roles and personas and performances? What do you actually want when you separate authentic desire from implanted craving? What matters to you, truly, when the noise of others' opinions finally quiets? These questions cannot be answered while running at full speed. They require a kind of attention that has become increasingly rare. The tragedy is that most people interpret this loss as personal failure. They blame themselves for being unable to focus, for feeling disconnected, for lacking clarity about their direction in life. But this is not individual weakness. This is what happens to human consciousness under conditions of relentless overstimulation. The mind was not designed to process this volume of information, to maintain this many connections, to respond to this constant barrage of demands. We have created an environment that treats the human psyche the way industrial agriculture treats soil. Extract maximum yield, flood it with artificial inputs, never allow it to lie fallow and regenerate. The result, in both cases, is eventual depletion. The ground loses its fertility. The mind loses its vitality. What remains is a kind of wasteland, still capable of producing output when forced, but no longer able to generate anything organic or authentic. This disconnect from oneself manifests in countless ways. You might find yourself unable to name what you are feeling, experiencing vague anxiety or numbness instead of specific emotions. You might notice that your reactions feel borrowed, that you respond to situations the way you think you should rather than from genuine feeling. You might discover that you do not actually know what you enjoy anymore, that your preferences have become a collection of algorithms and influences rather than authentic taste. The exhausted mind seeks relief through the very mechanisms that created the exhaustion. Feeling drained, you scroll for just a few minutes to unwind, which depletes you further. Feeling disconnected, you reach for more social interaction online, which deepens the alienation. Feeling purposeless, you consume motivational content, which provides a temporary spark that quickly fades back into emptiness. These are not solutions. They are symptoms disguised as treatment. There is a space that should exist between stimulus and response, a gap where choice lives. In that interval, you have the freedom to decide how to act rather than simply reacting automatically. But when stimuli arrive without pause, when one input immediately follows another in an endless chain, that space collapses. What remains is pure reactivity, a life lived on autopilot, moved by forces external to yourself, never truly choosing, but always being chosen. This is the real crisis. Not that people lack motivation, but that they have become strangers to the very self that motivation is supposed to serve. How can you feel driven toward anything when you no longer know who you are or what genuinely matters to you? The solution cannot be found in better time management or more efficient productivity systems. The problem is not organizational. It is existential. When someone says they feel stuck, that they cannot make themselves act, even when they know what needs doing. We tend to hear this as confession of weakness. The person feels guilty for their inability to perform. They apologize for lacking drive. They search for techniques and strategies to force themselves into motion. But what if we have misunderstood what is actually being communicated in these moments? Demotivation, seen clearly, is not the absence of something, but the presence of a message. The psyche is speaking, trying to communicate something essential that cannot be ignored forever. When the body experiences prolonged pain, we do not call it weakness. We recognize it as a signal that something needs attention. The same principle applies to psychological states. The inability to care about things that once mattered, the paralysis in the face of expected action, these are not defects in character. They are symptoms of a deeper misalignment. The soul, if we can use that word without sounding mystical, knows the difference between genuine purpose and empty performance. It can sense when effort is being directed toward goals that hold no real meaning, when energy is being spent on activities that serve no authentic value. And when this disconnection becomes too severe, when the gap between what you do and what actually matters grows too wide, something inside simply refuses to continue. This refusal does not feel noble or purposeful. It manifests as apathy, as exhaustion, as a strange heaviness that makes every task feel impossible. But beneath the surface, something important is happening. The part of you that knows truth is staging a quiet rebellion against the life you have been living. It will not be fooled by motivational slogans or productivity hacks. It demands something real. Understanding this transforms everything. The problem is not that you need more discipline to force yourself into action. The problem is that you have been acting without genuine reason for too long, and your deeper self has finally withdrawn its cooperation. You cannot whip a dying horse into running faster. You need to stop and ask why it is dying in the first place. This insight echoes the work of a man who witnessed human nature under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Viktor Frankl survived Nazi concentration camps, places designed to strip away everything that makes existence bearable. Food, shelter, safety, dignity, all reduced to their barest fragments. Death was constant, suffering universal, hope seemingly impossible. Yet even there, Frankl observed something that would shape his understanding of human psychology forever. Some prisoners managed to maintain their humanity despite the horror, not because they were physically stronger or luckier in their circumstances. What distinguished them was something internal, something that could not be taken away by external forces. They held on to a sense of purpose, a reason to continue existing that transcended their immediate suffering. It might have been the hope of reuniting with loved ones, or the determination to bear witness, or simply the choice to face death with dignity rather than despair. Frankl called this the will to meaning, and he built his entire therapeutic approach around it. He argued that human beings are not primarily driven by pleasure, as Freud suggested, or by power, as others claimed. The deepest human motivation is the search for significance, for a sense that one's existence matters in some way that extends beyond mere survival or comfort. This stands in stark contrast to how modern culture frames human motivation. We are told constantly that happiness is the goal, that comfort is the prize, that the purpose of life is to maximize pleasant experiences and minimize unpleasant ones. Entire industries exist to help us feel good, to avoid discomfort, to distract ourselves from anything difficult or painful. The underlying assumption is that a life optimized for pleasure is a life well lived. But Frankl's experience revealed something different. Even in conditions of extreme suffering, life could hold meaning. Even when pleasure was impossible and comfort unattainable, human beings could find reasons to continue, could make choices that affirmed their values, could maintain a sense of purpose that gave their struggle significance. Meaning, he discovered, does not depend on circumstances being favorable. It can exist anywhere, under any conditions, as long as the person can connect their existence to something that matters beyond their immediate experience. This completely inverts the modern understanding of motivation. We think we need to feel good in order to act, that we require comfort and ease before we can move toward our goals. Frankl suggests the opposite. Often it is through acting with purpose that we discover strength, through committing to something meaningful that we find the energy to continue. Purpose comes first. Motivation follows. This explains why so many attempts to address modern demotivation fail. We try to make ourselves feel better so that we can act, when what we actually need is to find something worth acting for, regardless of how we feel. We seek comfort when what we lack is meaning. We chase pleasure when what we hunger for is purpose. The existential emptiness that characterizes contemporary life is not a chemical imbalance to be medicated away, or a productivity problem to be optimized out of existence. It is the natural result of living in a way that prioritizes sensation over significance, that values achievement over authenticity, that measures success by external metrics while ignoring internal truth. You can have everything society defines as success and still feel hollow inside. You can accomplish goals, accumulate possessions, earn recognition, and yet wake up each day feeling that something essential is missing. Because what is missing cannot be acquired or achieved in the conventional sense. It can only be discovered through honest confrontation with the question of what your life is actually for. This question terrifies us precisely because it cannot be answered with ready-made solutions. There is no universal purpose that applies to everyone, no single correct way to live a meaningful life. Each person must discover their own answer, must find what resonates with their particular values and circumstances and capacities. This requires turning inward at a time when everything pulls us outward, requires silence when noise is constant, requires honest self-examination when self-deception is so much easier. The demotivated person is not broken. They are simply exhausted from pursuing borrowed goals, from living according to scripts written by others, from trying to find meaning in activities that hold none. The paralysis they experience is the soul saying that it cannot continue in this direction, that something must change at a fundamental level before genuine movement becomes possible again. What that change requires is not more effort within the existing framework, but a complete reorientation. Not doing more, but doing differently. Not pushing harder toward the same destinations, but pausing to ask whether those destinations hold any real significance. Not optimizing the life you have been living, but questioning whether that life reflects what actually matters to you. In a world that has declared war on emptiness, suggesting that people need more of it sounds almost subversive. We have been trained to see unfilled time as an enemy, something to be conquered with content and activity. The moment boredom threatens, we reach for distraction. The instant loneliness approaches, we seek connection through screens. The second discomfort arises, we find ways to numb or avoid it. This reflex runs so deep that most people no longer recognize it as a choice. But what if this avoidance is costing us something essential? What if the very thing we are running from contains what we most need to find? Silence, emptiness, discomfort, these are not obstacles to overcome on the path to a meaningful life. They are the path itself. Consider what happens when you finally allow a moment to remain unfilled. At first, there is restlessness and almost physical discomfort at the absence of stimulation. The mind, accustomed to constant input, does not know what to do with itself. It generates anxiety, produces reasons why you should be doing something, anything, other than simply sitting with what is. This initial reaction is precisely why most people never push through to what lies beyond it. If you can tolerate this discomfort without reaching for relief, something begins to shift. The frantic quality of thought starts to settle. The urgent demands that seemed so pressing reveal themselves as less critical than they appeared. A kind of clarity emerges, not the forced clarity of analysis, but the organic clarity that comes when mental turbulence subsides and you can finally see what has been there all along beneath the surface chaos. This is where the voice of authentic self begins to speak, not in dramatic revelations or mystical insights, but in quiet certainty about what matters and what does not. You realize which activities drain you and which nourish you. You recognize which relationships are genuine and which are performances. You sense which goals belong to you and which you have adopted to please others or meet expectations. None of this can be heard over the noise. All of it becomes obvious in silence. The discomfort we feel in the absence of distraction is not random. It emerges because silence forces confrontation with things we have been avoiding. Unresolved emotions rise to the surface. Difficult truths about our choices become undeniable. Questions we have been postponing demand attention. This is why the modern world encourages constant busyness. As long as you stay occupied, you can avoid facing what actually needs to be faced. But avoidance has a cost. Every truth we refuse to acknowledge continues to shape our lives from the shadows. Every emotion we push down continues to influence our reactions. Every question we ignore continues to create subtle misalignment between who we are and how we live. The exhaustion people feel is not just from overstimulation. It is from the constant effort required to keep unwanted truths at bay. Silence dissolves this effort. In the absence of distraction, there is nowhere left to hide. What has been buried comes forward. What has been ignored demands recognition. This process is not comfortable, but it is liberating. Because once you finally face what you have been avoiding, it loses its power to control you from beneath conscious awareness. You can begin to make choices based on reality rather than on the stories you have told yourself to avoid reality. This is what Frankl meant when he spoke of the freedom to choose one's response. External circumstances may be beyond your control. Suffering may be inevitable. But how you meet those circumstances, what meaning you make of that suffering, this remains within your power. This freedom exists in the space between what happens to you and how you respond, but only if that space is not collapsed by reflexive reaction or drowned in constant distraction. Creating this space requires intentional disconnection from the forces that would fill every moment with their demands. It means turning off the phone, not just for minutes, but for hours. It means refusing tasks that serve no real purpose, even when others expect you to perform them. It means tolerating the social discomfort of not being constantly available, constantly responsive, constantly on. These are not grand gestures. They are small acts of sovereignty, tiny rebellions against a system that profits from your perpetual engagement. Each time you choose pause over productivity, silence over stimulation, reflection over reaction, you are practicing a different way of being. You are retraining consciousness to value depth over speed, substance over sensation, presence over performance. This practice does not produce immediate results. There is no instant transformation, no sudden clarity that resolves all questions. What develops is subtler but more fundamental. A growing capacity to hear yourself, to know yourself, to trust yourself. From this foundation, authentic motivation can finally emerge. Not the forced drive that comes from external pressure or internal guilt, but the natural movement toward what genuinely matters to you. This motivation does not depend on feeling inspired or energized. It persists even through difficulty because it is rooted in purpose rather than emotion. You act not because you feel like it, but because the action expresses something true about who you are and what you value. This is the inversion that changes everything. Instead of waiting to feel motivated before you act, you discover purpose and let action flow from that. Instead of seeking comfort before you move, you find meaning and let that carry you through discomfort. Instead of trying to eliminate obstacles to motivation, you recognize that the obstacles themselves, the silence, the emptiness, the difficulty, are teachers showing you what actually matters. The path forward is not about acquiring more techniques or strategies. It is about subtracting the noise that prevents you from hearing the signal. It is about creating conditions where your authentic self can finally be recognized and honored. It is about having the courage to stop living according to programming and start living according to purpose. You still possess the freedom to choose. Despite all the forces shaping your attention, despite all the systems designed to keep you distracted and compliant, despite the momentum of habits and patterns built over years, you retain the capacity to interrupt the cycle. You can decide that this moment is when things change, not through dramatic transformation, but through simple refusal to continue in the same direction. What will you stop doing? What noise will you turn off? What distraction will you refuse? What silence will you finally allow? These are not abstract questions. They are invitations to specific action, to choices you can make today that begin the process of reclaiming your life from superficiality and returning it to meaning. The demotivation you feel is not your enemy. It is the signal that has been trying to guide you home. All that remains is to listen, to stop, to turn inward, and to finally begin living from what you find there.